All right, good morning. We'll go ahead and get started this morning a little bit ahead of schedule here. Let me finish pulling stuff up. All right. So good morning. Good to see everyone out this morning. Just to kind of start off, I know our last class session was a little bit shorter, so we're going to kind of go back and kind of hit some of that, just make sure we've covered that thoroughly enough before we move on. But just to kind of, as a refresher here, we've been talking about Christian evidences. Specifically, starting off, we're going through some of the more classical arguments for a creator. The ones we've talked about so far are the cosmological argument, which is essentially the first cause. You might call that the first cause argument. That is to say, the law of cause and effect is real. And every effect that we see on Earth or in nature must have had a cause. You trace that back far enough and you say, what is the first cause? And the cosmological argument says, well, the first cause must have come from some source outside of nature, something that's supernatural. And we know that is God. But the cosmological argument just kind of argues that there must have been a creator that's outside of creation, if you will. The teleological argument is the one we introduced last week. And this is kind of the argument for intelligent design. We'll dig a little bit deeper into that. I'll go ahead and show you, one of the potential, syllogisms you could use for this argument. And the idea is that wherever complex design exists, there must have been a designer. This is something we can kind of observe that we apply to things all the time. The second premise is that nature is complex. That's a difficult thing to argue, that nature is complex and it has a certain structure, a certain order to it. And therefore, nature must have had an intelligent designer. And the primary thing that we kind of talked about last week was this, the watchmaker analogy. This is something that William Paley put forth in 1802 in his book on natural theology, and this was kind of a groundbreaking kind of thing. And not that this hadn't kind of been discussed in the past, but he really put pen to paper. He was kind of a religious philosopher, and he really kind of nailed this down in a pretty solid way by use of an analogy, and specifically this analogy of the watchmaker. And just to kind of refresh, if you weren't here last week, or just to kind of recap that, the idea is that if you were to come across like a pocket watch in a field and pick that up and look at it, you would not suppose this must have always been here. No, instead you would suppose this must have been created by someone, not just created by someone, but designed by someone intelligent, someone more intelligent than the watch itself, if you will. And you would look at that watch and you would see certain characteristics of it, and those characteristics can translate into the world and the universe as we know it. Some of those characteristics we mentioned were the idea of order, complexity, interaction, and purpose. These are all things that you can see both in a watch and in nature to kind of help make that analogy mesh a little bit. All right, so we spent a good bit of time last week kind of going over that. And I do want to touch on a couple of these. I think, when we think about order and complexity, I didn't really get into this last time, but, Paley, after he mentioned this watchmaker analogy kind of at the beginning of that book, he went on and spent the rest of the book, really kind of studying things from more of a biology perspective. The rest of that book was really focused on specific things in the human body and, well, frankly, in animal bodies and everything else. Things that were so complex that it must have required an intelligent designer. Could not have happened by accident. And I think we can kind of understand that. He spent a lot of time talking about the eye, the human eye, animal eyes, the fact that the number of muscles that make up the eye. And I'm not, unfortunately, I'm not going to present a lot of biology here because that's probably my weakest subject in science. But one right after another, he went on to describe specifically things that are that are found in life, in living organisms that are so complex. Certainly in 1802, but frankly today as well. There are still things that scientists study that we only can begin barely to understand and to grasp. When you think about the human brain, we know so much more than we have in the past, but there's still so much more to learn. It is so complex. But the order is another thing. The simple fact that the universe is as ordered as it is the reason we have the scientific method, right? This is the reason we're able to study things. It's the reason we have scientific laws, is because the universe is ordered. So certainly, scientists, even naturalist scientists, can accept that the universe is highly ordered. And to think that came about through happenstance is somewhat absurd. But Scripture speaks to it a number of times. And one of the ones I want to bring up, I hate going through a Bible class and not reading at least one Scripture. So I've got one in here today. And it's going to get better. As we go through these kind of classic arguments, we're focusing a little more on philosophy. We'll certainly get more into the book as we go. But the last few chapters of the book of Job, if you haven't read that in a while, it's kind of amazing. God speaks to Job through a whirlwind and basically kind of lays out all the things that Job doesn't understand, can't comprehend. And frankly, many of those things are things that we don't really fully understand or comprehend either. And one of those speaks to the laws of nature, if you will. Job 38:33, God says to Job, "Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on earth?" And certainly this is an example of God kind of coming right out and saying, look, there's so much you don't know, but I do know because I'm the one that set it up. And that's kind of a tough thing for a lot of folks to appreciate, especially, if you're approaching things from a naturalist point of view. And I bring up that word naturalist. This is something I hadn't really touched on. I probably should have earlier, but when we talk about science and we talk about the different challenges that we deal with to some of these classical arguments, part of the challenge that we have is really kind of the definition that society has put on the word science. Basically, the National Academy of Science, they came out and they said the statements of science must invoke only natural things and processes. So they're essentially defining out the possibility that God could exist and could be defended scientifically. They say the statements of science are those that emerge from the application of human intelligence to data obtained from observation and experiment. And I don't so much have a problem with the last part, right? The observation and the experiment, but the idea that it must only be limited to natural things and processes is they're kind of establishing that worldview up front with which they kind of evaluate these things. So when you think about where we stand with this teleological argument, the idea that complex design exists, and where there is complex design, there must have been a designer, it comes, I think becomes pretty clear that there is a demand not just for a creator, but for a designer that kind of has this pattern in his head and can then go on and design creation to the order and the complexity that we see around us. Now, like I said, this was, the teleological argument has been one it's been around for a long time, had been around for a long time. I mentioned Paley. He really this work that he put together really was foundational in a certain way in really putting it forward and giving it a lot of thought even amongst the scientific community. It's hard to deny when you look at living organisms that there is complexity in design that can't be accounted for through known naturalistic things that we can observe. So that was in 1802 that he wrote that, and it stood for a while. And I mentioned last week that really one of the primary challenges to this idea of intelligent design is the theory of evolution. That's something that Darwin came out with. He published that in I think it was 1859. So we're only looking at maybe half a century where Paley's work stood before it was really seriously challenged. And that challenge came in the form of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, right? And that's where we're going to kind of pick up this morning, talking about the challenges presented by the theory of evolution. And we're going to counter some of those, and we'll probably, it may take us a couple of weeks to go through a lot of this stuff, but that's where I'm planning on heading this morning. Before we do that, any comments or questions? I kind of went through this really quickly. Again, it was just kind of back us up and talk about a little bit what we talked about last week. But before we move on, any questions or comments on this idea of intelligent design before we talk about some of the countering some of the arguments against it? Mike?
Jamie, I was just going to say, I think it's important to note from this one that, Christians, we have to defend the faults that we see in this world, death, destruction, pain, evil, those sorts of things. And that presents a challenge to the teleological argument. Of course, I think that's where the Bible comes in establishing the effect of sin and its impact. But then, from the evolutionist standpoint, they have to argue from the standpoint of how does non-intelligence produce intelligence?
Right.
How does it produce laws and that kind of stuff? And so I just think it's important to know we're not even arguing on the same playing field, really, in terms of what we're trying to accomplish with this intelligent design argument. And like sometimes we forget that.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
No, that's exactly right. Couldn't hear Mike mention that. There are other challenges. I mentioned evolution just because that's what I'm going to talk about first. But one of the other common arguments against the teleological argument that we as Christians need to have a ready defense to is the idea that there is pain, there is suffering in the world, and I do intend to cover that in this class in probably a couple of weeks after we get through with the evolution arguments. But that is something that, like I mentioned, do want to open the book. I mean, that is something Scripture speaks to. Mike mentioned the presence of sin. That accounts for most, if not all, of the pain and suffering we experience in this world. Certainly prior to the coming of sin, we see a perfect world, right? So we'll certainly spend some time on that, but that is up to the Christian to be able to defend that. And then he mentioned, evolution, where those supporting the theory of evolution will have their own defenses they need to make, and primarily among those, and this is what we're going to talk more about this morning, is how do you get intelligence from non-intelligence? How do you get life from non-life? All right, Kevin?
One of the arguments against this is the idea of these like suboptimal characteristics of animals, or maybe these so-called vestigial organs or whatever that we don't necessarily need in order to survive. And like you don't necessarily need a pancreas in order to survive, or you don't necessarily need an appendix in order to survive. And so these are, they would say, it would just be leftovers, right, from when our appendix is left over from when we had a different type of digestive system, or the whatever. And one of the things that we see is that the pancreas obviously has a very important function in our body. Same thing with the appendix. The appendix has the bacteria and stuff in it that can help. We'll get sick and our bacteria and our digestive system gets wiped out. Our appendix has the bacteria in it that can help repopulate and get better quicker. And so what we see is we may not know what the function is of some of these organs or things at the moment. It doesn't mean that they have no function.
Right.
Or just because we can live without something, we can live without our pinky on our hands and on our feet or whatever. Doesn't mean they don't have a function, and that we are, and we see is that we just may not know what it is at the moment.
Yeah.
And so, but that is one of the things, that Richard Dawkins wrote a big book about the panda's thumb, right? Is one of his arguments against this.
Yeah.
But we see that actually, even though it's weird, it looks weird, it's not as, like what we would think, it has a perfect function for what the panda's eating.
Right.
And so, anyway.
Yeah, and that is certainly one of the things that evolutionists present. They, there are a lot of arguments that they would present. Say, well, if there's an intelligent designer, why did he do it like this? Why do we see certain things that they would argue is are byproducts of evolution? And to Kevin's point, he says, well, a lot of those do have purposes, and even so, just because we don't understand what that purpose is, or we don't think it's quite that important, we wouldn't have designed it that way. Um, Again, so in some cases, we're kind of putting ourselves in the place of the Almighty God and saying we would have done it better than Him. That's a challenging place to put yourself. Hold on just a minute, Mike. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I thought I saw another hand. Yeah, go ahead. I put him on hold for a second.
Piggybacking off on what Mike said and what Kevin said, all in big picture. Mike said that make sure that we go back to the scripture. You can go back to Eden, where the scientist doesn't want to go because, oh, that's the Bible, that's just a myth. But look what happened when they were kicked out, and Abel dies, hordes came, punished to do, work the land, till the land, and that's how we got to that part. But what scientists don't realize when it comes to the animals, with things change. And what I'm talking about is the difference between macroevolution, the big creation of teleological, that everything, Big Bang, and then there's microevolution, the little stuff, like Kevin was talking about, like, okay, now we change a little bit. Why is it that this animal over here has thicker fur and this one does not? Well, okay, we can accept that.
Yeah.
And that makes the evolution argument, they can pause a little bit. And just like with me and my obsession with horses, we know spring is coming. We don't need a calendar or meteorologist, and the ancient peoples didn't need one, because when they start shedding like that, oh, spring.
Yeah, that's right.
Winter's coming.
Yeah. That's a great point, and certainly the difference between macro and micro evolution, this change, within species that is observable, that we do have evidences of, versus, this greater change, saying that, that even at higher than the species level, the argument that humans came from apes, or that birds came from fish, and all along things that we do not have evidence of, and even evolutionists would say, well, you really can't observe that because it takes too long. All right, Mike. Yeah.
Just real quick, and that's kind of where the point I was going with earlier is, we let scientists, we let people who purport the theory of evolution off too easy when we start talking about vestigial organs.
Right.
You talk to me about how you get intelligence out of non-intelligence, and I'll talk to you about vestigial organs.
That's right. Yeah.
The bottom line is you're assuming a form of intelligence, which is truly arrogant, when you start talking about vestigial organs before telling me how you get intelligence out of non-intelligence. And so Christians need to learn to not let people off the hook. Don't put you back on your heels and have you defending, explaining pain and suffering when you can't even tell me how you get laws from non-intelligence.
That's exactly right.
That's where we just have to learn to, of course, do it in a loving way, but just set boundaries and say, I'm not going to talk about vestigial organs, and say, you talk to me about how you get intelligence out of non-intelligence.
Yeah, very good. Great. Go ahead, Rolf.
I just want to give a hearty amen to what Mike just said.
Absolutely.
We let science off too easily. We let scientists off too easily.
Yeah.
We can talk about the things, and we are talking about those things that we might not have. I think we do have an answer, but sometimes the answers are involved, sometimes they're difficult, sometimes they're hard to understand. I think we do have an answer to pain and suffering, okay? And you will get to that. But it is difficult to explain. It's difficult to understand and so forth. And I appreciate, if we say the other side, having a question about that. However, for everything that we may struggle to answer in a certain way, wow.
Yeah.
There are so many things that science cannot answer.
That's right.
Science itself cannot answer. They'll tell us they can answer, but those that are evolutionists and those that are naturalists and strongly believe in these things, but they really can't answer. So we don't want to, as Mike said, we don't want to let them off easily.
Yeah.
And it goes back to how you define, where they define. What happens with science and evolution and naturalism is they assume the conclusion they want to get to, and then they design the evidence that gets them to that conclusion. That is totally a non-scientific process in and of itself. That's not what science is. Science says, take what you see, the facts, and what we can discover, and what we know, and all of that, and let that lead to a conclusion. They start with the conclusion, and then design and adjust their facts to get to their conclusion. Okay?
Right.
Now, to be honest, we have to be careful about that too, because we have a worldview, and sometimes we take a worldview that gets us, or a view of things that gets us to what our worldview is. So we have to be fair about that. But I've said this for years. Christians, if we understand some things about Christian evidences and exactly the study you're going through, there is no way we should ever let the naturalists, the evolutionists, the scientists, I don't care how many letters they have behind their name, okay? Let them intimidate us.
Yeah.
Because they just don't have the answers. By the way, many scientists go all of their lives trying to find these answers and often end up at the end saying, there must have been a creator.
Yeah.
Okay? All right?
That's
So
true.
we should not ever be intimidated or think that we don't have the answer to these things.
That's right. Yeah, very good point. All right, so kind of where all you guys are headed, that's where I'm planning on heading this morning anyway. So highlighting some problems with evolution. Now, first of all, let's define. We've kind of hit on the idea of evolution. I will say at the outset, there are a couple of different brands, if you will, of evolution. There are some who subscribe to a theistic evolution model. That is to say that God exists, in keeping kind of with what we've argued from the previous discussions, the laws and things like that. They say we can't deny that God exists, but we think that God started things in motion billions of years ago, and that that's where the life came from, and it continued to evolve. We'll get to that. I think that certainly problems with that from the biblical standpoint. That's certainly not what we read in Scripture. But the first couple of things we're going to hit on are more problems that are more with the naturalistic approach to evolution. That is to say, these are problems with the idea that Mike was just talking about earlier, the idea that life could come from non-life. So we're going to hit on the laws of probability. We're going to hit on the law of biogenesis, the idea of abiogenesis, which is really kind of necessary for naturalistic evolution to take place. That is the idea of spontaneous generation, the idea that life could come from non-living things. All right, and then the last point, we'll see. We'll at least introduce it this week, I think, is macroevolution versus microevolution, and what really does the theory of evolution state versus what the evidence supports. All right, so that's kind of where we're going to head with this. So start off with the laws of probability. All right, I want to introduce the idea of Borel's single law of chance. This is something that came from Emil Borel in 1962, and he says this law basically you could write it as events whose probability is extremely small never occur. All right, and this is important because the naturalistic evolutionist would argue that even if the chance is infinitesimal, if there is a chance, then over a long enough period of time, it's bound to happen. Okay, they kind of flip statistics and probability on its head, right? So when you're studying statistics, you're studying probabilities. You would say, this has a 99.9% chance of happening this way. You would say, well, it's like a sure thing, right? Well, and most scientists would agree with that approach until it comes to evolutionary theory, it seems. In which case they would say 99.9% chance. Well, there's a 0.1% chance that it goes a different way. Given enough time, that's bound to happen. Okay, and that's what they would argue. Well, a lot of flaws in that. I think we can kind of see that. That these things would require an infinite amount of time. For instance, we've talked about that already, and the challenges there. But really, this single law of chance states that if the probability is extremely small, they should be considered impossible. Not that just given enough time it's going to happen. Okay, you might think of you might have heard in the past. Well, you put a monkey in front of a typewriter and you leave him there long enough, eventually he's going to type out the words of Shakespeare. Okay, and I think we could kind of logic that, like, what kind of time are we talking about here? Infinitely much? I don't think it would happen even then, and that's kind of the point of this. Even in that situation, if you just leave things up to random chance, if the chance is too small, it simply will not happen. And the way Borel puts it, he says this applies to the sort of event which, though its impossibility may not be rationally demonstrable, is, however, so unlikely that no sensible person will hesitate to declare it actually impossible. If someone affirmed having observed such an event, we would be sure that he is deceiving us or has himself been the victim of a fraud. All right, so it's kind of putting something out there saying, if the chances of something happening are any smaller than this, you just automatically need to discount it as impossible. Okay, so how does that apply here? Well, for cosmic events, according to the Borel's law here, anything less than 1 in 10 to the 45th power is considered impossible. All right, that's pretty slim odds, right? 1 to the 10, or 1 in 10 to the 45th. That would be a 1 with 45 zeros after it. All right, I don't have a name for that number. 1 in 10 to the 45th. Anything smaller than that should be considered impossible. So what are the odds, as Mike was talking earlier, about life being generated from non-life, or about evolution being able to occur on any given planet? Well, a couple of naturalistic evolutionists have provided us estimates. Harold Morowitz of Yale and of George Mason had estimated the probability for formation of simplest living organism at 1 in 10 to the 340,000th. That's a 1 with 340,000 zeros after it. Okay? Much smaller, orders of magnitude smaller than what we should be willing to consider possible. Carl Sagan, an even more prominent atheist, estimated that the chance that life could evolve on any given single planet is 1 in 10 to the 2 billionth power. Now, it's not 1 in 2 billion, which is bad enough. That's 1 in 10 to the 2 billion, 1 with 2 billion zeros after it. Now, I didn't follow it all to see exactly how he came up with some of these estimates, but just to take their estimates, what they say the possibility is, and it's beyond infinitesimal. And if we were to apply this single law of chance to these occurrences, we would say that's impossible. How could you possibly, as a scientist, believe that that could happen? I don't care how much time you want to give yourself. How could you believe that that could happen? Well, turns out Borel, he himself is a naturalist. He didn't like the implications of this either. So he clarified that it is generally held that living beings are the result of a slow process of evolution beginning with elementary organisms, and that this process of evolution involves certain properties of living matter that prevent us from asserting that the process was accomplished in accordance with the laws of chance. All right, so he basically came out and said, like a year later, that this law does not apply to evolution because you're dealing with living organisms. That there is, and that if you're dealing with living organisms, now you're dealing with intelligence, right? You're dealing with a mind, so choices can be made. That would, you're no longer dealing with just simple chance. And that would be the evolutionist defense of these kind of things. However, even if you were to take that for granted and say, okay, when you're dealing with living organisms, sure, there are certain biological mechanisms in place. What about what Mike mentioned earlier? What about how did life come from non-life? How did non-living matter? How did non-living organisms get to the point where they became living organisms? I think in those cases, this chance would apply, right? Even if you accept Borel's premise that living beings would not be subject to this law, the idea that life could come from non-life would still be subject to that. In fact, I would go a step further. I would say that the idea of life coming from non-life is not just an extremely small probability. I would say this would fall under Kolmogorov's first axiom, which says that events whose probabilities are 0 are impossible events. Okay, There's a reason that's an axiom. It's pretty obvious, right? If the probability of something happening is 0, then that is an impossible event. It cannot happen. And I think that the idea of life coming from non-life has a 0 probability. It has never been observed. It has been, there have been series of experiments that prove that it cannot happen. And so I think that's where that would fall. Even if you took the idea that it is possible, the chances are so small it should be considered impossible. And in fact, the idea that life could come from non-life, and we'll talk more about that in just a second, has 0 probability. I think that kind of wraps that up for a minute. Any comments? Yeah, Kevin.
I mean, this whole argument is like same sort of thing. Like they say, what's the probability that the 60 people in here on this planet of 5 billion or 7 billion, whatever, would be here in this room together? Well, I mean, we would say the probability is extremely low, and then they would say, well, but you see that it happens.
Yeah.
So obviously it's possible.
Right.
And so the argument is that any probability of chance from happening, that's anything other than 0, it'll happen. And then they just, you see them coming up with more and more things. However many billion years they say that the universe has been around. If it's not possible during that time, then okay, well now we have multiple universes.
Right.
And we have this cosmic, somehow, printing of universes. So there's an infinite number of universes.
Yeah.
And in other universes, then the gravity's coefficient is different. Or in this universe, there are all these mistakes, if you will. And so we are here because of this infinite number of universes and this basically infinite amount of time. And here we have it.
Right.
We're here, and thus there must have been a possibility greater than 0. And so there you go.
Right, because
like we're talking about, it's the arguing backwards, and they keep expanding the realm of the universe in order to fit this idea that, well, we're all here, the 60 of us are here this morning, thus it's possible, thus here is how, whatever.
Right. Yeah, and that's where the argument comes that the probability must not be 0, it just must be extremely small because we're here, and we must have come here some way. And like I said, they've already defined out the possibility of God, right? And that's kind of the key, right? They're trying to answer this question, automatically discounting what probably seems obvious to the rest of us here. Yeah.
Yeah, I was sitting here thinking, oh no, numbers, I hate that. No. My first question to the scientist would be, excuse me, how did you get 1 to the 340,000? Could you explain that to me, how you came up with that number? Because number one, in math class, whenever I heard probability, it's like, oh no, please don't do this, because I don't get it. Well, that goes along with this.
Yeah.
Kids learn that number line.
Yeah.
It's 0 in the middle, everything over here is positive, and everything over here is negative. Okay, that means starting from 0, they're a big bang. Going over here, probability of numbers get bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so at 0, what happens with all the negatives? You don't know, and you ignore that.
Yeah, so again, probabilities are a little bit different than if we were just talking about time and that kind of thing. They've got some pretty solid arguments for arguing that, it's the chance is that small. I mean, if you said there must have been a chance and you automatically discount God, they can get to those numbers by saying, well, what are the odds? We know about this many elements in the universe. What are the odds that these could come together in this way? And those kind of things. And again, I didn't get that deep into it, but I kind of understand the idea that it would be that small, right? I mean, otherwise we would see it happening, and we could observe it. I mean, I think that's kind of their defense. This is why we can't possibly recreate this. The odds are so small, but we know it must have happened because there can't be a God. Okay. Any other questions or comments before we move on to some more discussion? It's kind of on the same topic, but more digging a little bit more into this idea of life from non-life. Okay. The next problem I think the atheists and the atheistic evolutionists are going to have is coming up with, how did life begin? All right. Even if you could successfully argue for evolution, how did it get started? And this is where I think the crux of the matter, and I think probably their most challenging defense is going to be is that they can't answer that question. They simply can't, in keeping with the laws of science that we are aware of. And the one primarily is this law of biogenesis, which states that in nature, life comes only from life, and that of its kind. Okay? This hasn't always been widely accepted. The idea that spontaneous generation of life could take place was actually held, but in the past. But it has been proven experimentally. This is something that is observable. One of the main areas, I'm going to kind of go through some of these experiments that took place. I mentioned Redi, Spallanzani, and Pasteur. I think we're all very familiar with Louis Pasteur and the achievements that he made and the understanding of science that we gained from him in a number of different ways. But this was over centuries, folks, doing these experiments on the idea that life could come from non-life, and finding over and over again that it cannot. The most widely accepted, I think, idea that gave way to the idea that the spontaneous generation may be possible is, back before there were microscopes, folks would have meat that would get rotten, and that rotten meat would get maggots growing on it, and those maggots would turn into flies, and they would look at that and they would say, well, clearly this non-life now, this dead meat, has spontaneously generated these maggots. No other explanation for it. That was pretty widely held up until Francisco Redi in 1688. He hypothesized that, well, these maggots, forming on the meat, maybe they're not spontaneously generated. Maybe they come from microscopic eggs that are laid by flies. This, kind of before microscopes and those kind of things, you couldn't just look and see the eggs. And so he did an experiment where he took meat and he put it in a few different dishes, and one he covered it, another one he put a net over it, another one he left uncovered. And as you might expect, sure enough, the maggots only developed on the one that was uncovered. The one that was covered did not develop them. The one that was even covered with a net prevented flies from landing on it, and thus he was able to prove that hypothesis. And say, look, what you guys thought was spontaneous generation was not spontaneous generation. As the years move on, folks continue to try to disprove Redi and find an example of life coming from non-life. Find an example of spontaneous generation. And that's where Lazzaro Spallanzani comes into play, 1768. Sorry, I'm not great at pronouncing these names. Another scientist by the name of John Needham, he claimed that he had found spontaneously generated microorganisms in a gravy. And he said this refuted Redi. He published his results, and Spallanzani said, well, is this can you duplicate this? And so he made the same gravy that Needham had, and he put them in bottles, and he boiled them to make sure all the microorganisms were dead. Now at this point, we can, science has kind of caught up to where we can view these kind of things a little bit. And he left one bottle capped and the other bottle uncapped. And as you might expect, microorganisms grew and developed in the uncapped bottle only. All right, not in the capped bottle. Okay, so again, another great experiment proving that Redi's hypothesis is correct. You cannot have spontaneous generation, and that is once again disproven. And this continued until, scientists continued to speculate ways that you could kind of justify spontaneous generation. And one of the thoughts was that, well, perhaps it's the air. Perhaps air has to be present, okay? And it still is coming from non-life, but we need air to be present for that to take place, for it to grow. So Louis Pasteur in 1864, he took kind of that same kind of a nutrient blend that was in the gravy of 100 years ago, and he put his he put them into flasks with curved necks, so like an S-shaped neck, right? So kind of goes up and down and up. And in doing that, it allowed air to get in, but any other dust or contaminants or whatever would get trapped in that S-curve, right? And in doing that, he was able to demonstrate, no, even in the presence of air, microorganisms cannot grow unless you can get to them, essentially. The dust and other things cannot spawn that life within that gravy. So Pasteur's work was very, very readily and widely accepted to essentially prove the law of biogenesis through experimentation, that in nature, life comes only from life and that of its kind. Even the biology textbooks, they talk about this. This is a great success. This proves the scientific method works. This is how we know things. All right. But then those same textbooks will still go on to say, sometimes even on the next page, other times in another chapter, that even though they'll kind of forget about these experiments by Pasteur, and they'll still argue that at some point spontaneous generation must have occurred, even though they've already taught us that it cannot, that science dictates that it cannot. And yet still when they talk about evolution, they say, even though we know it cannot happen, it must have happened, because there's no other explanation, because they have already discounted God. Okay. Since that time, there have been a lot of other experiments, and we're going to talk about one of the key ones that happened here in the 20th, or happened in the 20th century, the Miller-Urey experiment. Before we get into that, Kevin?
I was to say, when you're reading about their discussion about these things, they just sneak in words like, this is how it probably could have happened, and then they go in and say, oh, this, they'll explain it. And so they're like sneaking in language that it makes it sound on first glance like, oh, well, we know that this is how it happened.
Right.
When in fact, they're saying, this is probably, or could, and then they'll say, or they'll make definitive statements when really they're not definitive. Right. And they'll quote other people who are quoting other people who are then quoting them. And so it's this circular quotation of people. Yeah. We see this in the media, these days as well, where I'm quoting somebody else who's quoting somebody else who's then quoting me. Yeah. And so we have this circular quotation effect also. And so, it's very sneaky, but it's, but anyway.
You're exactly right. The same propaganda we see in the media, it's present in our textbooks, unfortunately. And it's that kind of thing where they talk with these absolutes about certain things, and then, you get, 6 paragraphs into the discussion and they say, but to date, they haven't been able to prove that life could generate in this way. They don't fully understand how life generates. And they may throw that in there, but it's so far down in the story that, and then when they talk about all the experiments that are done, definitely is going to lead the kids to believe it's possible, if not likely. So that's a problem. And again, it kind of goes back to the idea of saying that the science, cannot include God. All right, the last one I'll mention here is the Miller-Urey experiment. The Miller-Urey experiment was conducted in 1954, and this was probably the most aggressive attempt by naturalist evolutionists to develop in a lab life from non-life. And what they attempted to do there was to recreate the primordial soup that they argue must have been present and had the characteristics necessary to develop that life. And so they mixed methane, ammonia, water, hydrogen in a flask, and they conducted their experiment, temperatures and pressures and things like that, to try to reproduce what they thought was the environment at the time. And the result of that was that they were able to produce 2 amino acids. Now, amino acids are some of the building blocks needed to form a protein. There are about 50 building blocks you would need in order to form a protein. They only got 2 of them. So just on that stance, you would think that that's kind of a failure. Not only, you certainly did not create life, but you only created 2 out of the 50 things you would need to create one little part of life. However, like we said, so the way the textbooks might present this or had presented this was, this is successful. We've been able to reproduce, two of the building blocks for life. So I mean, surely it's only a matter of time before we're able to figure out the rest. So not only was it a failure on that stance, not only did it not produce life, did not even produce a protein, it only produced two of the building blocks that were needed. When you dig into their experiment, I mentioned the things that they put in that flask. Oxygen was not one of those things. Oxygen was certainly present at the time in the environment, in the atmosphere, even if you follow their timetables, right? The reason they excluded it is because they knew that amino acids would immediately oxidize, and so they just excluded oxygen from their experiment. So kind of a double problem with that experiment, right? Not only did they not produce everything that they thought they could produce, but they actually kind of fudged the environment a little bit into something that they thought would be more likely to work. And again, textbooks, they will admit this, but they do it in such a way that, the average student that's reading it could easily come away with, the idea that this was a positive step in the right direction. It's just a matter of time. We just got to tweak a few things and we'll have it. They continue to present it like scientists are close to figuring this out, when in reality, when they're pressed, they'll admit, no, the naturalistic scientists would admit that no, we really have no idea how the origin of life occurred. We just know that it must have because we're here. And we can't think of any other way it could have happened. Okay, so that's your biology lesson for the week, such as it is. And again, like I said, biology was probably my weakest of the sciences, so I'm glad Kevin's here to correct me when I get something wrong. And he can go fact check me this week, and I may have some corrections to issue. We'll see. But that's any questions or comments? Yeah, Rolf?
Yeah, years ago when I was studying this, Jamie, and I think Kevin was mentioning a little bit of this, they struggle so much with where life comes from, just as you've been saying. And they do all these experiments to see if we can spontaneously generate life or whatever. And they continue to struggle. It may be their greatest struggle,
Yeah.
How does life come from non-life? And so back then, when I was, again, doing a lot of reading about this, I don't remember, 5 or 6 years ago, okay? They were mentioning, Kevin mentioned the multi-universes. They just couldn't find the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So they decided that the way the answer was how life got here on Earth, if you will, in our universe, that there must be these multi-universes, okay? And from these multi-universes, or perhaps just one of the multi-universes, life came and got here on Earth, okay?
Right.
And this was given a name. I don't know, maybe somebody else remembers what the name. I don't remember the name they gave. They gave a name to this theory, okay? Well, I remember reading that, and I said, okay, all right. Where did life come from on that universe?
Yeah.
Okay, so again, they still can't find the answer, okay?
Yeah.
So anyway, they struggle, and they, as you indicate, they almost make up things to try to figure out how we got from non-life to life.
Yeah. That's right. And it all goes back to that assumption that there must not be a God. So there's got to be a naturalistic way that this happened. And yeah, similar to that, I mean, yeah, some of the things I was reading, and people suggesting that, life generated on other planets and was brought here, and kind of this planet was seeded with life from other planets. And again, begs the same question that your universe, the multiple universe theory does, is how did the life develop on that planet? Yeah, you really kind of start chasing some down some crazy rabbit holes there when you start doing this without thinking of God being present. I have another hand back here. Yeah, go ahead.
I find this super fascinating because last year I just graduated with a degree in biology, and so this is like super, super relevant. And I know especially where someone recently said it, but they'll call evolution a theory,
Mhm.
then they base everything around it as if it's a law.
Right.
And just think within they'll teach us to basically, we can't make laws anymore. Like there are no
Yeah.
living laws.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So then, if life started with that, then where did that come from?
Hmm.
But then they basically only consider the transition from non-life to life, so they won't consider where the methane or ammonia or water came from.
That's a great point.
So it's actually really, really interesting because they'll completely dismiss the theory of spontaneous generation, because like if you came into my classroom and you said like, oh, this dog gave birth to a cat, like you would like be escorted out like immediately, like that's
Right.
ridiculous. But then they find other ways of basically doing that or trying to explain that theory, and then they call it other things. Like the spontaneous generation is now like the Miller-Urey experiment, and so we're not calling it that because that theory has been refuted,
Hmm.
but they're still trying to prove that in other ways.
Yeah, those are excellent points. That's great. Yeah. Yeah, the Miller-Urey experiment did not start from nothing. It started with methane and water, and where did the methane come from, right? Yeah, that's a great point. Uh, and then and yeah, the idea that it is the theory of evolution. They'll admit it's a theory, it's a working theory, right? But they treat it as a law for certain, because everything in society seems to be based around evolution as the matter of fact. Kevin.
Sorry, one last thing.
Yeah.
When we're thinking about all this stuff, we got to think about also what are the incentives in place for people,
Yeah.
right? And the incentives in place for people especially in science, is prestige, right? And power and influence and money, right?
Right.
There's systems in place to make the incentives not to question this, because this is what we've all agreed on. Because if you're not going to get the money for the grant, so you're not going to get the prestige of being a chair of something, or and all these different things. So the incentives in place push people to be in some ways disingenuous and put blinders on
Yeah.
to what the facts say, because the incentives in place say no, don't look at what the facts say, look at what we've agreed is the facts, and then and do this. And so a lot of these things in life in general, what are trying to understand what's going on, we have to look at what the hidden economic incentives are that are in place that are pushing and influencing people's behavior.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's so much is about money and prestige. You're not gonna win a Nobel Prize when you're challenging the worldview of all the members of the committee. You're not going to get funding for your experiments if those who are funding it do not agree with you. So so much of this is just going along to even denying science, right? Denying the law of biogenesis in order to further your career. All right, next week we'll hit on micro and macro evolution. There's going to be a lot to talk about there. We'll talk about some genetics. I've got a lot to brush up on in my biology here. So I've got a couple of biology majors, it sounds like. So I'm going to work on that a little bit. But we'll hit on this next week. Again, microevolution. You can get heavier fur if you live in a certain climate, size, color variations within species, and then the idea of macroevolution. We'll hit on that, and then we'll talk about some of the implications of that. We'll talk about the fossil record. We'll see how much we can cover next week on that. But that's going to wrap us up for this week. So let's bow in prayer as we prepare to leave. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the wonderful world you've given us, and for your creation, for the laws that you have set in place that guide us and give us an understanding of you and your power and your presence. And we hope that we are always able to kind of recognize that despite the challenges, we know that you are in control in this world, and that we have our hope through your Son. We thank you so much for Jesus Christ and the salvation that we have through him. It's in his name we pray. Amen.